Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. GV.SC-04 Prioritizing Suppliers by Criticality. GV.SC-04 ensures that organizations categorize and prioritize suppliers based on their criticality to operations, cybersecurity risk exposure, and overall impact on business continuity. This subcategory belongs to the govern function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework version 2.0, emphasizing that not all suppliers carry the same level of risk, and organizations must implement a structured approach to vendor classification and prioritization to enhance supply chain security resilience. Without a structured supplier prioritization framework, organizations risk allocating security resources inefficiently, underestimating risks posed by high-impact vendors, and failing to secure critical supply chain components. By prioritizing suppliers based on criticality, organizations ensure that high-risk vendors undergo more rigorous security assessments, receive enhanced security oversight, and comply with stricter cybersecurity requirements. A structured approach to supplier risk ranking allows organizations to differentiate between suppliers handling critical infrastructure components, sensitive data, or essential services, and those with lower risk exposure, ensuring that cybersecurity measures align with vendor importance. Organizations that establish formal supplier criticality ranking methodologies, enforce differentiated security policies for high-risk vendors, and integrate supplier risk prioritization into enterprise cybersecurity governance, improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate supply chain cyber risks efficiently. Multiple stakeholders play a role in prioritizing suppliers by criticality. Executive leadership and procurement teams are responsible for defining supplier risk assessment frameworks, setting supplier prioritization criteria, and ensuring that vendor security risk ranking aligns with business objectives. Cybersecurity and risk management teams conduct supplier security evaluations, monitor vendor cybersecurity risks, and apply tiered security controls based on vendor criticality. Legal and compliance officers ensure that supplier risk prioritization aligns with regulatory requirements, contractual security obligations, and industry security frameworks, reducing exposure to supply chain compliance risks. Supplier prioritization is implemented through structured vendor classification models, continuous supplier risk assessment, and enforcement of differentiated security controls based on supplier importance. This includes assigning suppliers to risk categories such as high, medium, or low criticality, developing tiered security assessment processes, and integrating supplier criticality rankings into procurement and contract management systems. Organizations that fail to prioritize suppliers based on criticality risk, focusing security efforts on low-risk vendors while neglecting security gaps in high-impact suppliers, leading to increased exposure to supply chain cyber threats. Several key terms define supplier prioritization and its role in cybersecurity governance. Supplier criticality assessment ensures that organizations evaluate vendor importance based on their role in business operations, cybersecurity risk exposure, and dependency level. Tiered vendor risk models categorize suppliers based on their cybersecurity impact, allowing organizations to apply differentiated security policies. High-risk supplier identification enables organizations to detect and mitigate cybersecurity risks among vendors handling critical infrastructure, sensitive data, or core business operations. Continuous supplier risk monitoring ensures that vendor criticality rankings are updated dynamically based on emerging risks and operational changes. Regulatory compliance supplier ranking aligns supplier prioritization with national and international cybersecurity mandates, ensuring that high-impact vendors meet stricter security requirements. Challenges in prioritizing suppliers by criticality often lead to inefficient security resource allocation, weak enforcement of security policies for high-risk vendors, and failure to align supplier risk prioritization with enterprise cybersecurity objectives. One common issue is lack of structured supplier risk classification models, where organizations fail to assign suppliers to criticality tiers, leading to unbalanced cybersecurity efforts across vendors. Another issue is inconsistent application of security controls based on supplier risk rankings, where some high-risk vendors receive minimal oversight while low-risk suppliers undergo extensive security assessments. Some organizations mistakenly believe that all suppliers should receive the same level of security scrutiny, without recognizing that supplier prioritization enables more effective risk management and cybersecurity resource allocation. When organizations prioritize suppliers based on criticality, they enhance supply chain security resilience, optimize security investment distribution, and ensure that high-risk vendors receive appropriate cybersecurity oversight. A structured supplier prioritization model ensures that vendor cybersecurity risk assessments are aligned with business impact, supplier security policies are differentiated based on risk exposure, and high-priority vendors comply with stricter cybersecurity requirements. Organizations that implement tiered supplier risk classification models, enforce security controls based on vendor importance, and integrate supplier risk prioritization into enterprise cybersecurity governance, develop a comprehensive supply chain security approach that strengthens resilience against third-party cyber threats and ensures sustainable supplier risk management strategies. Organizations that fail to prioritize suppliers by criticality face significant cybersecurity, operational, and compliance risks. Without a structured approach, businesses may apply security controls inconsistently, misallocate security resources, and overlook vulnerabilities in high-risk suppliers, leading to supply chain cyber incidents. A common issue is failing to differentiate between suppliers based on cybersecurity risk exposure, where organizations apply uniform security policies to all vendors, neglecting the fact that some suppliers handle mission-critical systems while others provide non-essential services. Another major challenge is reactive supplier risk management, where organizations only assess vendor criticality after a security breach, instead of proactively ranking suppliers and applying preventive security measures. By implementing a structured approach to supplier criticality assessment, organizations ensure that high-risk vendors receive enhanced security oversight, prioritize cybersecurity assessments, and stricter security requirements to minimize supply chain risks. A well-defined supplier risk ranking framework helps businesses allocate cybersecurity resources efficiently, strengthen regulatory compliance, and enhance business continuity by ensuring that security policies are applied where they are needed most. Organizations that establish supplier criticality ranking methodologies, enforce security requirements based on vendor importance, and integrate supplier risk classification into procurement and risk management strategies improve their ability to prevent supply chain cyber threats and maintain operational resilience. At the partial tier, organizations lack formal supplier risk prioritization frameworks, leading to ad hoc security evaluations, inconsistent supplier assessments, and minimal enforcement of security policies for high-risk vendors. Vendor security governance is handled reactively, with organizations addressing supplier security risks only after an incident occurs. A small business at this level may treat all suppliers the same, failing to apply stricter cybersecurity requirements to vendors handling sensitive data or critical IT infrastructure. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured supplier risk classification frameworks, ensuring that vendors are categorized based on their potential cybersecurity impact. However, supplier criticality assessments may still be inconsistent, with security policies applied unevenly across different supplier tiers. A mid-sized financial institution at this level may evaluate supplier risk during onboarding, but fail to conduct continuous assessments leading to outdated vendor risk rankings. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured supplier prioritization framework, ensuring that vendor risk classification is standardized, supplier security assessments are continuously updated, and high-risk vendors are subject to enhanced security scrutiny. Supplier security governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing supplier risk rankings and ensuring alignment with cybersecurity policies. A healthcare organization at this stage may require all cloud-based electronic health record providers and third-party data processors to meet stringent cybersecurity controls, while lower-risk suppliers undergo standard security evaluation. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ AI-driven supplier risk intelligence platforms, predictive vendor cybersecurity impact analysis, and real-time supplier risk tracking solutions to dynamically assess vendor criticality and enforce security policies accordingly. Supplier risk management is fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that vendor security compliance, supplier risk rankings, and third-party cybersecurity governance remain continuously optimized. A global technology company at this level may use AI-powered vendor risk monitoring tools to analyze supplier security performance, detect real-time vulnerabilities in critical suppliers, and automatically adjust supplier security policies based on evolving risks. Prioritizing suppliers by criticality aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured supplier risk ranking frameworks and dynamic vendor security enforcement mechanisms. One key control is SA-12, Supply Chain Risk Management, which requires organizations to establish formal supplier risk classification frameworks, ensuring that vendor security assessments align with their importance to business operations. A manufacturing company implementing this control may develop a tiered supplier security assessment framework, ensuring that high-priority vendors undergo rigorous cybersecurity evaluations, while lower-risk suppliers follow streamlined security procedures. Another key control is RA-3, Risk Assessment, which mandates that organizations continuously update supplier risk rankings based on real-time threat intelligence, vendor performance, and evolving cybersecurity risks. A financial services firm implementing this control may use automated risk scoring tools to classify vendors based on security impact, updating supplier criticality rankings dynamically as new risks emerge. Prioritizing suppliers by criticality also aligns with SR-6 supplier security requirements, which requires organizations to define and enforce security expectations based on vendor criticality, ensuring that high-risk suppliers adhere to stricter cybersecurity policies and compliance measures. This control ensures that organizations maintain consistency in security enforcement across all supply chain partners, applying tiered security policies based on risk exposure. A global telecommunications company implementing this control may establish a multi-tiered vendor security program, requiring critical suppliers to undergo rigorous security audits, while lower-risk vendors adhere to baseline security standards. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic supplier prioritization procedures, ensuring that vendors handling sensitive customer data or core IT services receive enhanced security scrutiny, while lower-risk vendors follow standard security policies. A large enterprise may deploy automated vendor risk classification platforms, real-time supplier security impact assessments, and AI-driven supplier risk modeling solutions to ensure that supply chain security enforcement dynamically evolves based on supplier criticality and emerging cybersecurity threats. Organizations in highly regulated industries such as financial services, healthcare, and aerospace may require continuous supplier security audits, executive-led vendor risk assessment reviews, and industry-specific supplier risk categorization frameworks to ensure compliance with national and international security mandates. Auditors assess supplier prioritization frameworks by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced supplier risk classification models. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured supplier security assessment frameworks, enforce continuous supplier risk monitoring mechanisms, and integrate vendor prioritization into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance programs. If an organization fails to prioritize suppliers based on criticality, auditors may issue findings highlighting gaps in supplier risk classification, weak enforcement of high-risk vendor security policies, and failure to align vendor security governance with enterprise cybersecurity strategies. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Supplier risk ranking reports and structured vendor security categorization documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce structured supplier risk prioritization frameworks. High-risk supplier security assessment reports and vendor compliance tracking records provide insights into whether organizations proactively monitor vendor security performance and refine supplier security policies based on real-time risk intelligence. Incident response evaluations related to supplier security failures and third-party risk mitigation assessments show whether organizations effectively track vendor cybersecurity risks, ensuring that high-risk suppliers receive appropriate security scrutiny and oversight. A compliance success scenario could involve a global energy provider that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that suppliers are systematically prioritized based on criticality, ensuring that high-risk vendors undergo continuous security monitoring, third-party cybersecurity compliance frameworks are strictly enforced, and supplier risk categorization models align with enterprise cybersecurity policies. Auditors confirm that supplier risk assessments are continuously updated, vendor cybersecurity compliance is actively enforced, and supplier prioritization frameworks align with regulatory requirements. In contrast, an organization that fails to implement structured supplier risk ranking models, neglects security enforcement for high-risk vendors, or lacks formalized supplier prioritization frameworks may receive audit findings for poor supply chain risk management, weak vendor security enforcement, and failure to integrate supplier risk categorization into enterprise cybersecurity risk governance. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that suppliers are effectively prioritized based on criticality. One major challenge is lack of real-time visibility into supplier security risks, where organizations fail to continuously assess vendor risk exposure, leading to outdated supplier prioritization ranking. Another challenge is inconsistent application of security controls based on vendor criticality, where some high-risk suppliers lack adequate security enforcement, while lower-risk vendors undergo unnecessary security audits, creating inefficiencies in supply chain security governance. A final challenge is over-reliance on static supplier risk assessments, where organizations fail to update supplier risk rankings dynamically, preventing security teams from responding to evolving supply chain cybersecurity threats in real time. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured supplier risk classification models, ensuring that vendor security enforcement remains continuously prioritized based on business impact, and integrating real-time supplier risk tracking mechanisms into enterprise cybersecurity governance frameworks. Investing in automated supplier risk scoring tools, predictive vendor supplier cybersecurity impact analysis solutions, and AI-driven supplier risk assessment platforms ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine supplier security prioritization strategies in real time. Standardizing supplier risk classification methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that vendor security policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to third-party cyber threats and strengthening enterprise-wide supply chain security resilience. By embedding supplier risk prioritization frameworks into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies, organizations enhance vendor security accountability, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable supplier risk management strategies across evolving supply chain security landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.